You ever stop and wonder how a really messy argument, a classic he said, she said, gets turned into a cold, hard, undeniable fact? Well, it's not magic. It is the raw power of something called a legal judgment.
I mean, just listen to that. That quote really nails it. A judgment is that exact moment where all the chaos of different stories, these contested narratives, gets hammered into one single official truth. It's the point where the law steps in and says, okay, enough. This is what happened.
Okay, that all sounds pretty intense, but what does it really look like in the real world? How does the legal system actually take a messy human problem and stamp it with the full force of the state? Well, let's break it down.
So let's start at the very beginning. We're going to trace the path from a messy, real-world conflict to a clean, final, and enforceable legal truth.
Think of this as the basic assembly line for creating that truth. First, you've got adjudication. That's just a fancy word for the whole structured process. Then comes the hearing, which is the part you see in movies, right? Both sides get to tell their story. That leads to a verdict. The jury or judge decides who did what. And then, finally, the judgment. That's when the judge makes it official and turns that verdict into a binding order.
But here's the thing. Not every single case needs that whole, long, drawn-out process. The system actually has some built-in efficiencies. You could almost call them judgment shortcuts.
And here are two of the big ones. On one hand, you have a summary judgment. This happens when both sides basically agree on the facts, they just disagree on what the law says about those facts. So a judge can step in and make a decision without a full trial. Then you've got the default judgment. And this is simple. One side just doesn't show up to the fight. Well, the court isn't going to wait around forever. The person who did show up wins by default. It's the system's way of saying, hey, you got to play the game to have a say.
So once a court makes a decision, what does that judgment actually look like? Well, it can take a few different shapes, and each one has a very specific job to do. First up, you've got the big one, the final judgment. This is it. This is the end of the line, at least for the trial court. It closes the book on the main issues and locks in the legal consequences for good.
Now, when you get down to it, a court really has two main tools in its toolbox. A monetary judgment is pretty straightforward. You owe somebody money. But a non-monetary judgment, that's about behavior. The court orders you to do something, or more often, to stop doing something. That's what an injunction is. So one is about fixing the past with cash. The other is about controlling the future with a command.
Now, this is really important. A case can actually have many judgments along the way. While the final judgment ends the whole war, an interlocutory judgment is like a ruling on a smaller skirmish while the case is still going. I love this metaphor here. It shapes the battlefield while the bigger conflict continues. It's like winning a key hill before the final battle.
Okay, so the judge makes a decision. It's on a very official-looking piece of paper, but what good is that piece of paper if the other person just, crumples it up and throws it away? Well, this next part is where a judgment gets its teeth.
This is where we get to enforcement. Because honestly, without it, a judgment is just a suggestion. Enforcement is what makes a judgment sovereign, not just symbolic. It's the point where the state steps in and puts its muscle behind the court's words. And the main tool for that is the Writ of Execution. You can think of this as the court hitting the big green go button. It's the official order that gives a sheriff the power to show up and literally seize assets, your car, stuff from your house, to satisfy the debt. Our source calls it the state's kinetic force, and that's just perfect. It's the law in motion. Another really powerful tool is called a lien. This basically attaches the debt directly to a piece of property, like your house. Imagine trying to sell your home, but you can't, because a court has essentially glued this debt to it. This idea of legal gravity is great. The debt is physically anchored to something valuable until it gets paid. And then there's garnishment. This is when the court can order someone else, like your boss, to take money right out of your paycheck and send it to the person you owe. It's the law reaching directly into your income stream to make sure the judgment gets satisfied.
So, we've gone from the courtroom all the way to the bank account. But let's zoom out for a second. Why is this whole system so critical for how our society even works?
On a bigger scale, this whole system of judgments does four huge things for us. It puts a final end to disputes. It helps maintain order. It turns abstract ideas about rights into real-world action. And, maybe most importantly, it actually helps shape what the law will be in the future. Let's dig into two of the most important ideas here.
First, that idea of finality. There's a legal doctrine called res judicata. It's Latin for a matter judged. And the idea is incredibly simple. No do-overs. Once a court makes a final call, you can't just keep suing the same person for the same thing over and over again. It forces closure, which is absolutely essential.
And second, there's the idea of shaping the future. This is what we call precedent. When a judge makes a ruling, that decision becomes a guide for other judges in similar cases later on. This is what creates consistency and predictability. It ensures that the law isn't just random, but a stable system that builds on itself over time.
And all this brings us to this one final, really powerful idea. Think about it. The law itself is full of promises. You have a right to this, you're protected from that. But at judgment, that's where the promise becomes a command, an order that must be followed.
So we've built this incredibly powerful machine for turning conflict into an official, enforceable truth, a command. But that leaves us with one last massive question. What happens when that command is just plain wrong?